Well, hello, my name is Dan Conger, and today I'm going to be doing a video on what I call the FDA analogy for the burden of proof. Many people are familiar with the courtroom analogy for the burden of proof. That is, if there is a claim, who has the burden to prove that the claim is either true or false? And in this context, I'm mainly going to be referring to the claim that a God exists, a deity of some kind. No God specifically, just a deity. Does a deity exist? Who has the burden of proof to justify the claim that yes, some deity exists? As an atheist, I do not have that burden of proof. The theist is the one who has the burden of proof. An executive summary of the analogy is as follows. To get a drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration, a company needs to go through a series of rigorous clinical trials in animals, in petri dishes, eventually in humans. Those clinical trials must provide objectively verifiable evidence that whatever claim is being made, i.e. our drug lowers LDL cholesterol, that this claim is true. Many controls must be in place to prove that the evidence does not come from some other cause that lowered the LDL cholesterol for a particular participant in a study. But the executive summary is that through rigorous testing, it is the drug company that has the burden of proof to demonstrate that yes, their drug, their medical device, does do what they claim that it does. The FDA has no burden of proof. The FDA is simply awaiting the provision of the evidence at the conclusion of said trials. They will then evaluate whether the evidence is sufficient to justify the claim or not. If not, the company has to go back to the drawing board. So as an executive summary for this analogy, the theist has the burden of proof. They claim there is some God. This God has certain characteristics. They have to provide the objectively verifiable evidence, much like the drug company does. And the atheist is in the position of the FDA, where I'm not saying there is no God, although I don't believe there is one. I am simply awaiting sufficient evidence to be provided before I will agree to that claim. Now, to go into this in more detail. For any company, whether medical device or pharmaceutical, there are varying levels of clinical testing that have to be done before whatever product they have can be brought to market. Because people are very familiar in general with statins, in particular Lipitor, I'm going to use Lipitor here and during the detailed discussion to describe how this works. So at the beginning, a drug company would begin by doing petri dish testing. They would expose various chemicals, various cell cultures in a petri dish in very controlled environments to their pharmaceutical compound in that very controlled environment of a petri dish. And they would observe what effect does our pharmaceutical compound have on this cell culture, on this blood culture, whatever it happens to be in the petri dish. They're testing. They take that data, they would then evaluate it, retest if necessary. Often there are multiple levels of petri dish testing that take place before you even begin to think about small animal testing. And every single time you go through a new iteration of this petri dish testing, you have to refine your data. If you're finding mistakes or problems, you've got to strengthen your controls. And the goal is to produce a set of data that at the end of the process exclusively only directs you to one answer. That one answer being, yes, our compound, our device, it does what we claim it does. In the case of Lipitor, it will lower your LDL cholesterol in your bloodstream. So you begin with petri dish, you then move into small animals. You move into animals because you don't want to take a compound straight from a petri dish and put it into a human being. It's just dangerous. You need to make sure, because the way a chemical compound behaves in a complex living organism is obviously very, very different from how it may behave inside a petri dish. So you move into small animals, you move into intermediate sized animals, possibly rabbits or something like that. Then you move into large animals and eventually simian animals, so some kind of monkey, to get near to human physiology when you're getting into the more complex levels of testing, including proving that it is safe. Once a company has gotten through those early stages and has proven to a sufficient standard that it is safe to begin testing in humans, you then move into what's called a phase 1 clinical trial, which is your safety trial. The goal of this trial, one thing: is it safe for use in humans? Typically you have 1 to 200 participants. You're going to have a placebo group and a test group. And at the end of that trial, you are looking for one outcome: is the drug safe for use in human beings? If the answer to that question is yes at the end of that trial, then you move into your does this work trial. So the next one is going to be a few hundred patients, most likely participants, placebo group, treatment group. Now you're asking the question, does Lipitor actually lower LDL cholesterol? And this trial will be set up specifically to answer that question. Finally, the third layer, and this is the weakest part actually of the FDA process as it currently exists, your long-term, what's called a mortality and morbidity study, or a pivotal clinical study. This is a long-term study, usually conducted over a period of years with thousands of patients, in as many locations as you can get them. And this is intended to show what happens to someone when they are on this pharmaceutical for a long, extended period of time. Is it still safe? Does it still work when the patient has been taking the drug and it's been in their system for months, for years at a time? This is to illustrate that, once again, the FDA at no point during this process is telling, it was Pfizer with Lipitor, is telling Pfizer, your drug doesn't work. We don't believe you. We definitively claim that it does not work. No, they're being agnostic about it, much like most atheists are actually agnostic atheists. We're not saying definitively there is no God. We are saying, do you have any evidence? Please provide it to me. And if your evidence proves that there is a God, I'll accept the claim. If Pfizer's evidence proves that Lipitor does lower LDL cholesterol, I will accept the claim. One of the interesting things here, though, to illustrate this a little bit more clearly, one of the things that gets said in a lot of debate that I see, and in a lot of other discussion, is theists will bring up a so-called miracle or some other event that they say is evidence for the presence of a God. And the atheist will then ask the question, well, couldn't that have been caused by something else? Couldn't there have been another cause? Okay, Granny was undergoing cancer treatments for years, and then her cancer went away. You want to call it a miracle. I want to say the medical treatments that she was going through for years worked. So how do you eliminate other causes of the observed effect? Back to the Lipitor example. Let's say you have a patient who is in the treatment arm of a clinical trial. It's the efficacy trial that is intended to show that, yes, this drug works. This patient, at the same time as they begin participating in the trial, thank you, airplane. At the same time they begin participating in the trial, this patient also begins an aggressive exercise regimen, and they go vegan. So they radically change their diet and their exercise routine. At the same time, they begin Lipitor. Well, the FDA would ask the question, how do you know that it was Lipitor that lowered their cholesterol versus their exercise and diet change? So to control for this, in a clinical trial, participants would quite literally be told, do not change your diet or your exercise habits. Keep whatever diet and exercise habits you had, keep doing them, because we want to eliminate this other potential cause for lowering cholesterol. Thus, in the clinical trial, you'd be able to isolate other possible causes of someone's cholesterol going down and limit it just to the introduction of the drug as the only possible cause. These controls aren't perfect, but they are intended to eliminate other possibilities. So, dear theist, if you're going to say that your God cured someone's cancer, for example, how do you know that it wasn't the medication, the medical treatments they were going through for years that caused it versus your God? Give credit to the medication first and claim the supernatural later. To give a good illustration of how a process like this works from a drug perspective, we're going to look at another cholesterol drug called torcetrapib. You've probably never heard of it. And the reason you've never heard of it is because it failed in its pivotal long-term M&M study. Torcetrapib was intended to raise your good cholesterol. Your HDL can be compared to a garbage truck. HDL is cholesterol that runs around your body. It collects excess fats. It collects excess garbage. It removes it from your body. It delivers it to the liver, where it is removed from your body's system. So in theory, the hypothesis was, if we boost HDL levels, essentially if we introduce more garbage trucks into the system, those garbage trucks will pick up more garbage, they will cleanse the body's systems, and it will provide an improvement in clinical outcomes for cardiovascular patients. Well, it worked. During the efficacy trial in phase 2, it absolutely did raise HDL levels. And when taking it alongside Lipitor, which lowers your bad cholesterol, it actually had a profound effect on the cardiovascular system. But it failed clinical trials for the following reason. It was found that in the treatment arm of the torcetrapib trial, more patients died than in the placebo arm. Not only did more patients die during the trial in the treatment arm of the trial, where you're supposed to be doing better, but adverse events, i.e. a stroke or a heart attack that did not result in death, but it happened during the trial, adverse events were also far higher in the treatment arm and lower in the placebo arm. Now, if this drug is safe, you'd expect that to be the absolute reverse. So torcetrapib the trial was canceled right in the middle of the trial, and it was determined that the reason torcetrapib was a problem is that it increased blood pressure. And if you're increasing a patient's blood pressure when that patient is a symptomatic cardiovascular patient, that's a bad thing. So the FDA pulled the plug on that trial. Torcetrapib never saw the light of day. Pfizer spent over $800 million getting torcetrapib to that point and then lost it, versus Lipitor, which was successful. So that's an illustration of how the FDA process is supposed to work. Sometimes it fails. Vioxx got to market, and then it was pulled later because it was found from long-term data that it was dangerous. But the way this process is supposed to work is that evidence is collected. That evidence directs you exclusively to one conclusion, and that one conclusion justifies your claim that this drug works or it doesn't. Dear theist, we are asking you for exclusive, objective evidence. Evidence that shows that the only possible cause of a given phenomenon is the God that you worship. And if the evidence that you provide is either not exclusive, like the cancer claim, it could have been the drugs and the other medical procedures that cured, your family member. If it's not exclusive, then it is rejected. It's just not going to fly. So that is the FDA analogy for the burden of proof. And here's a kicker. In the FDA analogy, I could hold up a vial and I could show you, this is the compound that we are testing. This is the thing that the evidence supports, this thing here. With your claim, dear theist, about a God, you can't even hold up the God. We have to have faith that your cure, the God, even exists. And then we have to have faith that the thing we have faith in can cure us of our disease. With a drug, I don't have to have faith that the drug exists. It's there. And I have data that supports what the company claims it does or doesn't do. With your God, you have none of that. Definitive evidence, which can only be directed towards one conclusion. This is what we're looking for. And this is what the FDA analogy illustrates. We collect data. That data supports one conclusion with regard to a given medical treatment, and that conclusion is either accepted or rejected based on the strength or the weakness of that data. Thank you very much for listening.